For our 10th video in the new Patreon series on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua, I'm going to discuss my novel, Yeshua the Unknown Jesus, a fictional life of Jesus, but based on history and what can be known about Yeshua, not only historically, but through his teachings and through a knowledge of the history and culture of the area where he taught and was born. So I'm going to look through the whole issue of how the lives of Jesus were written in the past and what I've done that's different. Now, Yeshua was not the Jesus of Christianity. Like all gods, the Jesus of the New Testament Gospels was a mythic deity reflecting the Hellenistic culture that created it. Myth is useful for understanding the psychology of a culture, but regrettably, Christianity believes that the New Testament Jesus was a real person, which is simply untrue. However, the mythic savior and revealer Jesus of early Christianity was based on legends about a brilliant Jewish sage and prophet whose name was Yeshua HaNatzri, Yeshua of Nazareth. His Davrim and Mashlim, which we today call his sayings and parables, were passed on orally, and they were translated poorly from Aramaic to Greek and then expanded with Holy Spirit channeling in the Christian communities. Only by understanding how this oral material was passed on and how it was added to and how it was transformed and how it was spun can we go back behind the New Testament to understand historical things about teachings and the life of Yeshua. So these teachings in the New Testament were spun to reflect the doctrines of Paul, Pauline, and other doctrines about Christ in the New Testament Gospels and other early Christian writings. Now, modern scholars can identify authentic teachings and unspin them and reconstruct what Yeshua taught, which is radically different from Christian doctrine, but highly relevant for 21st century humanity. That is what I and many other people have done. I recently published a comprehensive translation and analysis of Yeshua's extant authentic teachings for my students to use as a lectionary for their home temple services. And you can buy this book online as a Kindle edition for $9.99 or as a paperback book from me personally at one of my Yeshua workshops. So let's take a look at what were supposed lives of Jesus and speculative biographies of Jesus or Yeshua, which have been created really from the earliest times of Christianity to produce a sort of myth about the life of Yeshua. The four Christian Gospels in the book of Acts were collections of mythic legends about Yeshua that were developed and expanded during several generations that passed after his execution. The writers were not historians. They did not have historical sources upon which they relied. For example, none of the disciples were present at the trials of Yeshua, and yet the Gospels give detailed accounts of what was said and all this sort of thing. These are fictional. This gospel history, New Testament history, was based on later legends and out-of-context prophecies that were cherry-picked from the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, in order to create a biography of Yeshua. For example, in Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, we have incidents, for example, like the escape from Herod into Egypt because Herod was slaughtering children on the model of Pharaoh slaughtering the children of the Israelis or the Hebrews in Egypt. Well, there was no slaughter of the innocents by Herod, but of course the reason that occurs in the gospel is because there is an out of context saying that was taken as a prophecy of Yeshua that said, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And of course, Yeshua was understood to be the Son of God, which in Hebrew and Aramaic meant one who was a righteous person, but to the Greeks meant a physical son who was actually conceived by intercourse with God. And so, of course, he had to be brought into Egypt so he could be brought out of Egypt. And so we have the story of the flight into Egypt and then the coming out of Egypt. And then, of course, there's another place that was taken to be a prophecy of a Messiah, and that says that, "Oh, thou Bethlehem are not the least of all the cities, because," etc. The Davidic Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Well, Yeshua was not born in Bethlehem. He was born in Nazareth, but according to the stories, they're coming out of Egypt, and they go back to Bethlehem because they can't get back to their home city in time, and they stay in a stable, and the baby is born. The whole nativity story and the whole thing about the three wise men, all this sort of thing, all this stuff is not history. These are fictional stories based upon things that were cherry-picked and plucked out of the Greek New Testament, and Old Testament rather, I should say, in order to create a biography of Yeshua. So simply put, the writings of the Gospels were fictional compositions intended to promote faith in the new Christian religion and its deity, Jesus Christ. And Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, Acts are not historical documents, but Christianity has treated them as historically accurate. And from the 2nd century on, Christians have composed supposed biographies of Jesus based on literal interpretations and artificial harmonies of the gospel stories. Now, one of the things I might add here is that it is extremely naive of people like scientists who don't understand very much about biblical criticism to assume that there was some kind of star or comet that appeared at the birth of Jesus, and try to find, some evidence for this and that sort of thing. This story is fictional, and so to try to find evidence of a stellar phenomenon that creates this nativity star and all this sort of thing is based on something that's not even historical. So why would scientists try to find it? Why would they try to find an event that could be related to that? And people have, suggested comets and supernovas and all kinds of things, but none of that is relevant to these stories because they are stories. And so this attempt at creating or spinning a story, a life history of Yeshua based on these fictional creations of the early Christian writers was done by creating harmonies of the gospel stories. In other words, as you probably are aware, the four gospels contradict themselves on all kinds of things, on the sequence of events, on events that actually happened, what happened during these events, even during the actual life of Yeshua, during his ministry, which is what the Gospels really cover. And so because they have all these contradictions, people tried to harmonize them. They wanted to find ways that every bit of that could all be true. And so these harmonies of the Gospels were created, and then that was used to create these lives of Jesus. In the 2nd century, Tatian wrote the Diatessaron, which was a harmony or conflation of the four traditional Gospels that was intended to resolve all their conflicting information, which simply can't be done because they are four separate fictional compositions. The project was further developed by early church scholars like Ammonius and Eusebius. In the 5th century, St. Augustine of Hippo wrote extensively on harmonizing the Gospels. There are modern harmonies by biblical literalists and fundamentalists, and you can buy them at all these Christian bookstores that tell you the life of Jesus In fact, you can even get coloring books that tell you this fictional life of Jesus. Uh, so this idea that we can uh, create a life of Jesus from the stories in the Gospels is very popular, and it's been done for a long time. Uh, the first person who actually regarded Jesus to have been a real human being and have been born and raised like human beings and so on was uh, a French writer who wrote a life of Jesus called Renan, and that was done well over a century ago. And since then, people have been more and more interested in trying to discover the Jesus of history. But as Schweitzer and others concluded nearly 100 years ago, there just isn't the information, there isn't the historical information to create a life of Jesus. Today, there are speculative attempts to illuminate the life of Yeshua by modern scholars using archaeology and Jewish historical writings, and they are worth reading. This one by Chelton I put up here, Rabbi Jesus, John Dominic Crossan, who recently passed away, has tried to put together historical information about Jesus, Yeshua. He does not do the job as well as I would like to see it done, because he still portrays Yeshua as a Galilean peasant who was kind of a political revolutionary, and that's not actually true. So here are the clues for a probable life of Yeshua that I have used in writing my novel, which is fictional, but it's a historical fiction that's called Yeshua, the Unknown Jesus. In addition to what scholars have speculated, I find that the pre-Christian teachings and earliest records about Yeshua reveal many things that illuminate his own life story and probable personal history. He was the firstborn of several children in a family of Joseph and Mary in Nazareth, and that's implied by the earliest historical records of the Despossani, or relatives of Yeshua, which we have a lot of information about. In Greek, the word monogenes can mean firstborn or especially beloved, and of course that's applied in the Greek New Testament to mean the only begotten Son of God, and so on. But he was definitely a firstborn in this family. And therefore, as a firstborn, he would have been initiated into his father's Jewish guild of stonemasons. Remember, the lineages that are shown in both Matthew and Luke for Yeshua, although they're different, they all begin after the return from exile in Babylon. They all begin with Zerubbabel. And who was Zerubbabel? He was the first Jewish stonemason, the first Jewish mason, the first Jewish architect. He was the architect who taught people how to rebuild the temple. And he had learned those skills in Babylon, and he's said to be the ancestor. Well, we know that Joseph was a teknon, that's the Greek word that's used, and what it means is not a carpenter. It means a skilled worker in materials, and the only materials that existed in that whole area around Galilee, around Nazareth and so on, was stone. There was no wood for carpenters to work. There was very little. It's very clear that Joseph, or the father of Yeshua, was a stonemason. And if he was a stonemason, and if he was of the lineage of Zerubbabel, then he was a member of a Jewish guild of stonemasons. Like all Roman guilds and other guilds at that time, there were 3 grades, just like there are in modern Freemasonry. There was an apprentice, and a fellow craft, and a master. And Yeshua, as the firstborn, would have been the person who would carry on that tradition, would be allowed to join that guild and learn from it. Now, Yeshua proclaimed a prophetic messianic basor. This is not the gospel, what the Christians call a gospel, but a proclamation directly from the throne of God to all the people of Israel that was given publicly, not in small meetings of just disciples of a rabbi. He proclaimed this basor very similar to that proclaimed by John the Baptist. And I've shown you this before, but if we put what we have preserved in Matthew and Luke and Mark about what Yeshua's public proclamation was, we put it back into Aramaic, what he was saying is the ancient rule of evil, that is, that rule that is talked about in the prophecies of Daniel, which were made and written in Babylon, in the great Babylonian Jewish high culture of the period. The ancient rule of evil is now passing away, and God's rule of justice and divine life among humanity is drawing near. Submit to God. The word is nacham, to submit. It meant to submit by receiving the baptism of John, and keep faith, or be faithful with the basor, with what the proclamation is. This is the proclamation that basically John the Baptist was giving, and that Yeshua's disciples were carrying out for him. Now, Yeshua obviously had a very close relationship with John the Baptist, and the Zoroastrian Gnosticism attributed to him by the Mandeans, who seem to have originated as a sect of John the Baptist, founded by his disciples, who never converted to Jewish Christianity, and who still consider John, Yahya ibn Zachariah, to have been the true suffering Messiah. And the Mandeans still exist. There's a very large community in Los Angeles now, and although their traditions there are written traditions and oral traditions, and research into the history of these Jewish Gnostics known as Mandeans that seem to be they seem to be the remnants of the sect of John the Baptist. There is much that is not known, and a lot that can't be really verified, but it's definitely rooted in Zoroastrian, Chaldean, Babylonian Gnostic understanding of some very profound mysteries. So John the Baptist was not just a guy going out preaching the end of the world or something. He was a very accomplished sage, and what he knew and what he did was and was known for publicly was made people of his era consider him to be the Messiah. And when he was martyred, when his head was cut off, many people considered him to be the Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering Messiah that later Yeshua would be considered to be. Now, the Gospels take great pains to subordinate John and make him into a precursor to Yeshua. He's not really that important, but during Yeshua's time, John was absolutely the most important person. He was considered to be the most brilliant prophet of his era, and led tremendous spiritual power at his time. But even though the Gospels try to subordinate John to Yeshua, here are some facts. All the Gospels recognize that Yeshua was baptized by John, which is a form of commitment that was made by disciples, that Yeshua began his ministry with a desert retreat immediately following his baptism, and that Yeshua and or his disciples continued to give the baptism of John to their followers after John's martyrdom, and that many of Yeshua's disciples had also been disciples of John. All this information is contained in New Testament accounts. So it's very important to understand the connection between Yeshua and John the Baptist, and that is another bit of information that we can understand historically rather than just in terms of the way it was spun in the New Testament. So Yeshua, by the way, was not a simple Galilean peasant revolutionary, as some modern scholars have portrayed him. He was a highly educated Galilean sage who opposed the Judean legalistic halakha, or laws of men, not of God. He was a Pharisee, but the Pharisaism of Galilee, which was much more closely linked to the more sophisticated teachings of Babylon in many cases, with the exception of the Zealot movements. The form of Pharisaism that Yeshua advocated and was trained in and understood was quite adverse and opposed to the form of Pharisaism that was found in Judea and in Jerusalem and in the Sanhedrin, which was a legalistic form that developed all kinds of sub-commandments and rules that had to be followed in order to be pious. The Galilean sages were based on the idea of what the prophets had taught about the righteousness that exists in the heart, and about compassion, and about care of the poor, and all this sort of thing, rather than simply following strict halakhic rules about what you could eat and what you couldn't eat and when you could eat it and all that kind of stuff. So we know that Yeshua was quite aware of and taught a lot of very sophisticated things. My book, in which I talk about the 80% of the Gospel of Thomas that preserves a lot of the midrashic and Kabbalistic teachings of Yeshua, show very sophisticated interpretations that were typical of Babylon and the Babylonian Talmud. We know, for example, as I've mentioned before, we have some of the incidents were recorded in Talmudic literature about one of the great Galilean Pharisaic sages, Eleazar ben Hyrcanus, and he was contemporary with Yeshua, and like Yeshua, he argued that the Jerusalem Sanhedrin Pharisees did not have the authority of God behind their strict legalistic halakha, and like Yeshua, he refused to accept the what he called traditions of the elders of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, and like Yeshua, he was a native of Nazareth. So we have some insight into an awful lot of the orientation that Yeshua would have had as a sage, as a person who was deeply initiated into Pharisaic midrash. And he, by the way, from his teachings, we know that he knew both the schools of Hillel. Hillel began in Babylon and then finally ended up in Palestine, and Shammai, who had the most powerful and influential school in Jerusalem, and he was a member of the Sanhedrin. We know that Yeshua was quite familiar with the teachings of these schools, and he was critical of them, even. We also know that he viewed himself as a prophet. He said, "No prophet is without honor except in his own village," etc., etc., etc. So we have a lot of that kind of information that gives us an insight into what kind of a person he was. And we have more. Yeshua developed his own more advanced midrashic teaching that was influenced by Babylonian wisdom traditions and the Danielic Son of Man, or Bar Enosh Messiah, as a new humanity, not just a single person or a single figure, a Messiah, but as a whole new Israel, a new humanity. And these were Babylonian teachings, and we know them because we can see them from different literature that existed in the ancient world. The school of Daniel, that wrote the Apocalypse of Daniel, based upon the legendary figure of Daniel, who lived in the 5th century BC. That book was written about 150 BC by a school of people who were considered to be in the lineage of the disciples of Daniel. And that is the book that became the apocalyptic definition of what a Messiah was. And to carefully read that and know that is Babylonian Judaism. And in Yeshua's teaching, this was the end of a long period of humanity's self-generated bondage to evil. They're making the wrong choice, choosing the not the Yetzer Hato, but the Yetzer Hara, choosing the evil inclination, the selfish inclination, instead of the selfless inclination, and therefore had put themselves, all humanity had put itself under bondage to evil. And he was preaching the advent, the coming, the now coming of divine sovereignty through self-liberation. And that word sovereignty, of course, in Hebrew is Malkuth, which is wrongly translated as kingdom, but it meant sovereignty. Each of the angels has a sovereignty, a form of service and power to be responsible and have stewardship for different parts of the divine world. And that is what Yeshua was talking about. He also was very much imbued with the Galilean spirit of the prophets, interpreting the commandments as inscribed in the heart, justice and compassion, and interpreted that as halakha, a way of living and interacting with others in a messianic age that is already coming into manifestation. So what Yeshua taught was the way to live, the halakha, the way to live in the approaching messianic age. For example, we have from Jeremiah, which is written as part of the Babylonian literature after the exile, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts, was the prophecy about what would happen in the Messianic age. And this is probably the original meaning of Yeshua's teaching, that the Malkuth of God is within you. Not the kingdom of God, but the sovereignty of God is within you. The Aramaic idiom translated literally within you was in your heart. So this view of spiritual view of spirituality is the most essential part of his prophetic influence that is Galilean, and Galilean Pharisaism rather than Judean. Now, Babylonian messianic expectation was not eschatological as it was in Palestine. Eschatological means the world is going to end and there's going to be huge disasters. The Babylonian Jews were not zealot revolutionaries. They did not live under forced Roman rule as in Palestine, where zealotism and revolution developed. And yet it was the Palestinian view of messianic expectation that got put into the New Testament view that basically came from Paul's view, because Paul, of course, never had studied with Yeshua, had never known Yeshua, and he refused to take a lot of instruction from the apostles of Yeshua. Instead, he, as he says in his letters, he learned everything from his own private revelations. But we also know that he was a student of Gamaliel, who was a Judean Pharisee who taught the legalistic views and the idea of a Davidic Messiah who was an individual person who would come out of the sky with armies, etc. And all that gets projected onto the concept of a second coming of Jesus that we have in the New Testament, and the rapture and all that kind of stuff. These were not parts of the teachings of Yeshua, they were the teachings of Paul. And the fact remained that Yeshua's teachings were not eschatological as Paul would represent them, but they were apocalyptic, meaning they were revelationary, and they were based on the revelations of what would be coming for humanity. So Yeshua taught a non-eschatological Babylonian apocalyptic revelatory midrash. This was a Babylonian vision of a messianic age on earth brought in by the incremental works of spiritually transformed humanity, as in the books of Jubilees and Daniel, and this is all implied in the parables of the kingdom, so-called the parables of the Malkuth and the mustard seed and so on, that we have preserved of Yeshua's teaching. It's not a vision of the catastrophic end of the world and divine judgment, but of a transformed and sanctified earth. It's not a pessimistic eschatological vision, but one like that of the Book of Jubilees, in which, to quote Charles' description, as I have quoted for you before, the Malkuth, or the Messianic age, the sovereignty, it's all the same thing, would be gradually realized on earth, and the transformation of physical nature would go hand in hand with the ethical transformation of humanity until there was a new heaven and a new earth. So this is what Yeshua was teaching. It was Babylonian, it was not Palestinian. And that's why he satirizes the Judean Pharisees' idea of a Davidic Messiah in a saying that is preserved in all three synoptic gospels, where Yeshua says, "Why do you say Messiah is the son of David?" That is the Davidic Messiah who comes out of the sky, who's a warrior. When in fact David says in the Psalms, "The Lord said to my Lord," etc., etc., and then you say, how can he be his son if he is his Lord? So Yeshua is adverse to this concept of Messiah that became standard for Christianity and was pushed by Paul. So his teachings imply that many of his lost years were spent in Babylon in a Jewish wisdom school. That's historical information. Another thing is he had very enlightened respect and compassion for women. Now this is, he even accepted and taught female disciples, and that was not done by other sages or rabbis. And this implies that he had experienced an intimate relationship with a woman that he loved. He had learned about women from a woman, not just from his own outside compassion, and most likely through a marriage. And given his attitude towards divorce, which was the ruling of Shammai rather than Hillel, Hillel said you could divorce a woman for burning your dinner. Shammai said divorce was adultery because it was committing a horrible act against a woman and a wife. Given this attitude that Yeshua had, the reason he had no wife during his prophetic mission, even though he obviously had had some kind of very important intimate relationship with a woman in his past, the reason he had no wife during his prophetic mission was probably because she had died and there were no children. Now that's a bit of historical probability that I've used in my novel. There are many parallels in his teachings to a variety of sophisticated Hellenistic, Buddhist, Mandean, or Jewish Gnostic and Merkaba and Hermetic philosophy and practice, and these are found in his inner circle teachings and in his public teachings as they're spun in the New Testament, and they imply exposure to several cultures, not just to that of Galilee. So Yeshua had probably traveled extensively, and because of these exposures, he probably had gone as far as Egypt and the Indus River in Asia. I'm not a fan of the assertions that Yeshua spent time in India and was called Saint Isa and all that sort of thing, because that information is not historical. But it is clear that he had exposure to Buddhist ideas. And in my novel, he learns that through the lands that were subjected and subdued by Ashoka at that period of time, and who had then written his precepts about Buddhism on great rocks in several places that could be read in several languages. So we also know that these Kabbalistic, Gnostic, and Merkaba themes of Yeshua's teachings were carried forward in earliest Christian writings, and they imply that they were original with Yeshua. So a little bit about my novel about the life of Yeshua. I used scholarly insights and historical implications like these to write my own fictional biography of Yeshua. It's called Yeshua the Unknown Jesus, and I have PDF files of it online. You can buy it through Kindle for $9.99, and you can get it as a bound edition. It's a pretty big book at all the online bookstores. I wrote this in the years 2006-2007, and I did the last third of the book. I wrote that in the Himalayas near Almora, and in the wilderness near the home of Lama Govinda. The purpose was to give laypersons an entertaining way to understand who Yeshua was, as scholars can understand it, how his life path might have developed, what his education and influences might have been, and why his pre-Christian teachings are vitally relevant for modern people. And my goal was to have the book transformed into a film script and made into a movie. I still hope that will happen. The movie, I feel, would inspire many people to read the novel and become interested in Yeshua and his spiritual teachings. Now, while I was in India on one of my visits, I was taken at the urging of a Vedic pundit to go way, 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 way out of civilization into a village that I had to travel many, many miles off of the road in order to get a special kind of reading from what we call a copper plate reader, who was a Hindu priest. And I tell the whole story of it online. I'm going to post a link for that for you, because it was what Achyuta, the name means Krishna, but it's a name of a 15th century Vedic astrologer who is supposed to speak through the copper plate reader and the copper plate readings, and the script actually appears on these flat blank copper plates, and sometimes he uses silver plates. And what his prophecies were about my writings, and especially my writing of this novel, Yeshua the Unknown Jesus. So I'm going to put things online, or I give you a link that you'll find probably below in the description of this video, and maybe as a clickable link that I can put actually into the video, about the predictions about this novel received through a Hindu priest on December 9th, 2006. So for a Patreon pledge of $4, you'll receive a link to the PDF file of my novel, Yeshua the Unknown Jesus, plus other writings I've done about the pre-Christian teachings. The paperback version, as I said, is available at all online bookstores, and there's also a Kindle version. So please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. Thank you.